Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Libenson, and I'm here with Benay Lappe. And we are excited to welcome you to the first of a number of conversations here on Jewish Live that we're going to be doing relating to Passover coming up and what we're calling pandemic Passover, the idea that this is a Passover unlike any Passover we've had before in Jewish history. There may have been other Passovers when they've been complex, but they've been differently complex. And we thought that it was important. We're hearing a lot of anxiety from people about how is my Passover going to be this year? I'm used to having Passover in a very particular way, and I can't have it that way this year. So what am I supposed to do? And so here at Jewish Live, we thought maybe we could help with that a little bit. And we were talking about that there are really two elements of the Seder for most people, actually three. One is the getting together with family, what I call kind of the Thanksgiving dimension of Passover. And that has its own set of complexities and this year. And then in terms of the ritual aspect or the Seder itself, let's say, there are two parts of it really. One, the rituals, the symbolic foods, the various things that we do, the various songs that we sing. And that is a set of issues that we're going to explore, hopefully, in other conversations. That's not really the subject of today's conversation. That is going to be really hard because a lot of those rituals are a little harder to do, or maybe not even fully possible to do. For example, it's really hard to sing on Zoom together because of the buffering. So what do we do? Well, we have to explore some of those things, and that's some hard work that we're going to try to talk about later on in other conversations. The other part of the Seder is really the idea of having the conversation. The Seder is supposed to be a conversation. It was based on the Greek and Roman symposia. And the idea is that you have a really intense philosophical conversation over the meal. And in many ways, it seems to me like that is easier to do this Passover because there certainly is a lot to talk about. And to really dig deep into the story of the Exodus and ask, what does it mean for us today? How do we relate to it today? Seems like it's actually pretty easy. And so what we wanted to do in this conversation was talk about that a little bit, to suggest ways to perhaps get into that conversation, and maybe a little bit to role model the conversation itself, and to give you some points that maybe you can use to spark conversation at your own Seder. So Benay, let's just start here. And like, what does that bring up for you? What's on your mind?
Well, as I think about Passover, I'm thinking about something that one of my teachers, Rabbi Eddie Feinstein in Los Angeles, taught me a long time ago. And what he said was, every holiday, every Jewish holiday is basically a booster rocket for some value, concept, character trait, something that we want to inculcate in ourselves. And it's not that whatever it's a booster rocket, whatever any holiday is a booster rocket for, doesn't exist in the other times. That's why it's a booster rocket, right? Like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's a booster rocket for tshuva. It's not that you don't do tshuva every other day of the year. Of course you do. Ideally you do. And ideally you don't need the booster rocket. But the holiday comes around to say, you know what, everybody's human. There are a bunch of relationships that you left behind, you haven't been paying attention to, a bunch of aspects of your own life that you've been ignoring. To whatever extent you were ignoring those, now's your time to really focus on it. So if every holiday is a booster rocket for some important way we think we should be as people, what's Passover a booster rocket for? And I think an easy answer would be, it's a booster rocket for remembering the question of who's free and who's not free, and to recalibrate our sensitivity to who's not being free, or to go super personal, where am I not free? And I want to drill down a little further past that to, I think, something I learned from another one of my teachers, Yitz Greenberg. And what I learned from him is that what's radical about Passover is the idea that a small group of people took their own personal experience, right? The idea of being liberated from oppression, and told it as a story whose central message is not, look what happened to us, so you can see we should be free, but rather this thing happened to us. And so we know in our kishkis, with our lived life experience, that everyone should be free.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's an insight from Yitz. And here's what I've been tripping about today. What if actually what Pesach is here to do is not even be the booster rocket for that insight about our freedom is a lesson about everyone's freedom, but rather what we needed to be to have that insight, which is that we needed to be so confident of our own lived life experience, which was a very marginal life experience, that we were able to take that life experience and say, I have something to give to the world. So what if this year Pesach is about something bigger than even these questions of freedom and liberation? And the question is really, what do I know in my kishkis from my life experience that I need to bring out into the world as a message for everybody? I don't know, maybe it's too meta, but that's what I've been tripping out on.
No, so I heard, it's interesting, like I heard that basic message more recently from Richard Elliott Friedman, the Bible scholar, who wrote a book called The Exodus, where he tries to show that the Exodus really happened. And he doesn't mean signs and wonders. He means that there was a group of people that were slaves in Egypt and they became freed from that slavery. And they came ultimately to the land of Canaan. That's what he's trying to say actually happened. And in the book, not to overly give a spoiler alert, but I mean, I am giving a spoiler alert, but I don't think it's a super spoiler because he's talked about it. He ultimately claims that people that were actually slaves and that were freed became the Levite tribe of Israel. And that in the same way that we kind of say we all came over on the Mayflower, we adopted the story of this subgroup, the Levites, as the story of all the Jews. And his point, and I asked him, why is it so important to you that this story actually happened? And he said, because if it's just a nice story that somebody came up with, and you say, well, there was a great imaginative storyteller who came up with this story, and it's a great story, and it still has those messages that, people were released from slavery and they should still work for the freedom of everybody, but it's just a story that some storyteller came up with. If it actually happened, that there was a group of oppressed people that became freed and that decided for themselves that the message that they were going to teach their own people was to care for the widows and the orphans and the poor, then that's beautiful. And that they basically taught that message to the world through Judaism becoming influential on Christianity, on Islam, and elsewhere, that actually the world got this message that the way that we should interpret our own history of oppression is that we should make sure nobody else is ever oppressed again. That's a beautiful thing. And I want to be part of the people that had that history. So now the question, I guess, in my mind about what you're describing is how does that relate to what we're going through? Because the way that I've been thinking about it is that traditionally we have this idea in the Seder. It's in the Seder, in the text of the Seder, and it's also in the Mishnah talking about the Seder, that in every generation, every person should feel that they personally left Egypt. And so somehow the Seder, and maybe we can talk more about this later, that the ritual of the Seder is supposed to enact some transformation upon us. Like I think of it as eating the Eucharist, where you actually are supposed to be taking the body of Christ into you, and that somehow changes you in a profound way. So that somehow through the Seder, we actually are changed and we become those freed slaves. And I think that that's actually a leap of imagination that's kind of difficult for people in most times. And I also think that a lot of people don't even know that that's what you're supposed to be doing at the Seder. We haven't done a very good job of teaching that. This year, it almost feels like we don't have to engage in that active imagination. Like we are all going through something momentous, and that feels kind of like a scary, oppressive time, that maybe the question is, what do we like on the other end of it?
Okay, it was a big question. I want to put that aside for 1 second, because you know what you made me think of? When you say we've forgotten how to actually reenact the experience, or to help us get into the experience, it reminds me of my whole thing about matzah making and matzah. We think that the mitzvah is just eating matzah, and I don't know, how powerful is that? Okay, it's better than nothing. But actually, the mitzvah, or an additional mitzvah, is making your matzah. When my daughter was a little girl, I used to help her touch Shabbat, making challah every week. And when it came to Passover, I thought, oh, I can't make challah. We're going to have to make matzah. So I thought, okay, this is a good excuse to buy this expensive wooden handmade flour mill that I was really wanting. So I buy
We
this.
know, by the way, you and I love our toys.
I know. It's all about the toys. It's all about the swag, and it's all about the toys. Okay, so I get this wooden wheat mill, and I hooked it on the kitchen table. I go to Whole Foods and I buy the wheat berries. I put them in, and my daughter and I are cranking. Okay, it's magical when you crank wheat, a mill, and out comes this warm, fine flour. It's amazing. And we make matzah. And then I'm getting really curious, and I start digging into the codes and Talmud, looking into matzah. And I realize that it actually is the mitzvah to make your own matzah in the hours before the first Seder. And that experience that I was having with my daughter of making matzah, that I thought, this is powerful. It's not just fun. Oh, I get it. It's like, oh, that's what they used to do. They used to make their matzah like this. And we used to have technologies like these practices that we've forgotten, because now we can, or we've been convinced that you have to go to a store and buy, someone else's kosher matzah. We used to have these spiritual technologies that did a better job of helping us reenact an experience. Okay, so to come back
before you go back to my question, though, I want to comment on that only in the sense that we're going to be posting a video tomorrow on Jewish Live that Barry Dollinger has made, and he's an Orthodox rabbi who we interviewed on Judaism Unbound a few weeks ago, who started a soft matzah factory, a soft matzah company. And I asked him if he could make a video showing people how to make the soft matzah at home, because actually I think I don't actually know how to make hard matzah. I guess it's probably not that hard also, not that difficult, but it seems like to make soft matzah, and you're supposed to do it in 18 minutes. So how hard could it really be?
Right.
And it turns out it's not hard at all. Right. And so we're going to be posting this video. And I think that actually in a time when people might not be able to get matzah, like I'm not even totally sure how I'm going to get matzah. So fine. So you can make this matzah in 18 minutes, and it's probably tastier than the boxed matzah. So it's really so that's where this situation is kind of like an opportunity to make your Seder even better than usual.
Yeah. And one of the things I discovered in that process was that the tradition is not all that worried about you getting it wrong. It's, if it were that worried about you messing up your matzah and chumitzing up your matzah, it wouldn't tell every family to make their own matzah. It would tell just the Manischewitz company to be making the matzah, but it doesn't. It's that you do it yourself. You're careful, you do it as best you can, but okay, you're going to mess it up. Maybe. Is it going to be a tragedy? No. That's why they invent this formula. It says, okay, if I messed it up, all the chametz is null and void, and that's fine. And I think now is a great time to re-embody that experience of, don't worry, it's okay if you mess it up. We're doing our best. And, it's a very empowering, actually, tradition that we've gotten afraid of. And we've gotten to this place of, oh, only the professionals can do it.
Right. By the way, on our Jewish Live website, we've started an area for Passover resources. And on the overview page, last night, I was just thinking, I came up with 4 new questions. And one of them was, on all other Passovers, Uncle Harold tells us that there's one right way to do the Seder. But on this Passover, nobody knows how to do it right, including Uncle Harold. So it's very liberating.
Yeah. Okay, now we had to get back to your question.
So my question was something along the lines of that maybe the leap of imagination that we are asked to do every Passover, which a lot of people don't even know that we're being asked to do, but a lot of people do know, but we do it very poorly, I think, through the traditional Seder structure, that maybe somehow the fact that we don't have to imagine, I mean, we would have to imagine if we were saying we were slaves in Egypt, but we don't have to imagine, for example, what it's like to be alone in your home, afraid with only your family, hoping that the angel of death will pass over your home. I mean, that is exactly what we're experiencing right now.
Yeah. And what comes up for me as you say that is, it's going to take some radical honesty. And it's going to take the willingness to be vulnerable in a way that we are not at all used to, especially with our families. You know, we have staff meetings for Svara every Monday morning, and we always do a check-in. And for the last 2 weeks, or the last number of weeks, I feel like I've been doing okay, and I've been so busy. You know, we've all been so busy with the logistics and kind of getting our food situation settled and getting our new routine settled. And, you know, for some of us waiting out the 2 weeks. And today, for the first time in the check-in, you know, my check-in was basically, I'm feeling kind of crappy. I'm feeling not so much physically, but I'm having a really hard time. And I knew that the team was going to have room for me to say that. And we ended up really talking in a way that was really helpful, that helped me feel much less alone. And anyway, to get back to the Seder, I think it's going to be an opportunity that we should take to really talk about what it's feeling like for us to be in a very anxious, fearful place, and what are the things we're afraid of.
Mm-hmm.
I'm afraid of things that I have never thought about in my life. I mean, all of us are. And it actually helps to name them and to articulate them. We don't feel so, you know, you feel a lot less quote unquote crazy, a lot less, I'm the only one, who are thinking of really tachlis, scary scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one way
Mm-hmm.
to use our present experience to not have to pretend that we were there, because we are right here.
Mm-hmm.
And to surface, what does it mean to be right here?
But let me share with you what I think, what that makes me concerned about, which is that if we focus on what we're going through right now, then my concern is that we lose what I think is one of the important purposes of Passover, which is to learn from our experience of oppression and reorient ourselves towards those who are more oppressed than we are. Now, I don't know if that was the original intent of Passover. In fact, I'm pretty sure that it was not the original intent of Passover, meaning I think the original intent of the rabbinic Passover, meaning Passover after the destruction of the temple and the whole idea of a Seder, I think it was to remember that we were slaves in Egypt and God freed us. So even though we are now feeling oppressed, right, and I'm talking about the Jews in the early centuries, right, that the Romans were against them and everybody was against them, and then later in Europe that the Europeans were against them, and in Arab lands, you know, that the Jews were always oppressed, or often oppressed, and that in a situation where you yourself are oppressed, then having a Seder, which is reminding us of this time when we were oppressed in the past and God saved us, it's kind of like, well, maybe he'll save us again, you know, and so let's have faith in God so that we can feel that we'll get through the hard times that we're in now, because however hard it is, it was harder in the past, and so there's some kind of hope. I think over the last 100 years, let's say, maybe 200 years, in the time when the condition of the Jews has largely been much better than that, there has been maybe a new element or a new interpretation of the Seder that I think most of us are experiencing, at least subconsciously, which is that we're not so oppressed anymore. And so what is the purpose of an experience where we're remembering a time when we used to be oppressed? It's to be so thankful that now we're not oppressed anymore. And now maybe, and in the way I've been thinking about it in recent years is like, maybe we're more in the story like Pharaoh, and that maybe we're oppressing others, or maybe we're more like God in the story and that others are oppressing others, but we maybe have the power to intercede. like God had the power to intercede. And right, the Exodus story talks about how God heard the cry of the Israelites. I mean, where was God for the 400 years, before? But all of a sudden he heard, and there are all these people who are being oppressed in our world today, and maybe we should listen. Maybe we should hear them, and these are all the ways that I've been thinking about Passover in recent years. And I actually think that it's a really good new interpretation of Passover. And it's so good that I actually think a lot of people don't hear it as a new interpretation of Passover. They think like, oh yeah, that's exactly what Passover is, and I'm like, yeah, that's only in our lifetime or in sort of the recent times. I'm worried a little bit that now that we find ourselves in a time when we are the suffering ones again in certain ways, but we also are the people who are in a position to help others who are suffering more than us, that we might focus too much on our own suffering and not enough on that reorienting of our concern towards those who are in a worse shape than we are.
Yeah. Okay, here's what's coming up as you're talking. What we now have insight into beyond our own personal experience right now is what systemically is crashing, which had been in a long crumble and had crashed for lots and lots of people. But those of us who had more privilege because we had more money, or because our skin was white, or because we were able-bodied, or because we were cisgendered, heterosexual, you name it, didn't quite feel the urgency of, didn't quite feel the pain of, but had been crashing. And now we're all experiencing the crash of our healthcare system and our labor and wages system and the extent to which we're interconnected. And maybe that's where to go from my personal experience. From our personal experience now, we go not to, okay, how do I feel better? But what do we now all realize is the matter with our larger systems, right?
Right.
That's what we need to fix. We should have been going there all along.
Right.
I don't know.
And I think that in terms of the way I framed the session at the beginning was what you're saying and what I'm asking. It's like there's not a clear answer to it, but I mean, this seems like a good conversation to have at the Seder. Like, this seems like exactly the point, is like, let's not just say the easy thing. Hey, we were slaves and now we're free, and so we should protect others, or we were slaves and now we're free, we should thank God, or we are now afraid of coronavirus and we should hunker down and protect ourselves, or we should realize that the system is crashing. I mean, all of those, like, that's the conversation to have. I mean, right, that's and so anybody who's kind of feeling like, I don't know how to have a Seder over Zoom, to my mind, it's sort of like, raise these questions, and this seems like it'll be a pretty good evening.
Yeah. And then maybe we can figure out four new questions. Like, what are the questions? What are the rituals that can help us ritualize and recreate the realness that we're playing with?
Right. I mean, so I think that there's another element of Passover, of the Exodus story, right? Because I guess I would also frame this by saying that the commandment in the Mishnah, commandment isn't the right word, but the law in the Mishnah is that you're supposed to tell the story of Exodus at the Seder and discuss it. The Mishnah specifically tells us to use a particular text from Deuteronomy as the framing text for the Exodus story, which is a little bit of a weird framing text to use, because it's like, not, I mean, if you're going to tell the book of Exodus, I mean, if you're going to tell the Exodus story, it seems like, why don't you read the book of Exodus? And there's nothing in the Mishnah that says you shouldn't read the book of Exodus. Like, you shouldn't actually talk about the book of Exodus, but it just says you should use this particular phrase from the book of Deuteronomy as a kind of framing conversation. We could talk about why it uses that text. I have my theories. Other people have different theories. It actually, in the Torah, comes from the text that you're supposed to say on the holiday of Shavuot, when when you brought the first fruits offering at the temple. And like, my theory is that after the temple was destroyed, they couldn't say that anymore because there were no more first fruits offerings. And it was kind of like almost like a song that they really liked, like the Pledge of Allegiance, if, the Star Spangled Banner, and what, just because the temple's destroyed, we can't sing the song anymore. Like, we'll put that at Passover,
I love that.
Right. There's maybe other all kinds of other theories that you could say, but the point of it all is that I think that for those people who follow the Haggadah very carefully, if your practice is kind of to go around the table reading the Haggadah, then you might not have the experience of really discussing the Exodus story. You may be reading these somewhat opaque lines from the book of Deuteronomy that the Haggadah has a very particular number of rabbinic kind of commentaries, like God's hand, he had 5 fingers and, an arm, and it means there were 50 plagues. It's like these things are kind of esoteric. And I would sort of encourage people to this year to say, let's actually talk about the Exodus story and what happens after the Exodus, for example, which is that all of a sudden the people have left Egypt, which is, they were slaves, but it was a very familiar environment. And we know from the Torah later that they often say they want to go back to Egypt. And we've been taught to read that as so crazy. Like, how would you want to go back to be a slave? But let's really kind of imagine that right now, right, we really, I think a lot of us say, if we could only go back to the way things were before the coronavirus, even though it wasn't that great. So that's
because it was pretty good for a lot of us. A lot of us thought it was pretty good, and we weren't really appreciating how bad it was for so many other people. And we're like, oh, I just want capitalism again. Oh, I just want my private health insurance again. I was having it pretty good. Oh, yes. What you were talking about the Haggadah, I was thinking about the way we often use the Haggadah, like this formula, which if we recite it, it's going to have magical powers. And I'm reminded of this story that my guru, when I was living a very devout Buddhist life, used to tell about this man who went to his doctor, whom he trusted so much. He had so much faith in his doctor, and his doctor examined him and he said, "This is your illness, and here's your prescription." And the man took the prescription home and he set up an altar, and he made offerings on the altar to his doctor, and the prescription was in the center. And every day, 3 times a day, he recited the prescription: take these 2 pills in the morning, take 2 pills in the afternoon. And he never got better, obviously, right? And the whole point isn't that you recite the prescription. The whole point is that you take the medicine. So I think our question is, what's the medicine of the Haggadah that we're supposed to take? Like, I think that's the question, rather than reciting the prescription of the Haggadah.
Well, on that score, right? I mean, like, I've been talking about the Haggadah, that it's like, imagine a time when we had some really amazing cake, and everybody loved to eat this cake. And they kind of said, like, how do you make this cake? And they said, oh, well, we have a cookbook. It tells you how to make all these cakes. And for a while, people made the cakes out of the cookbook. But for some reason, something happened. And people, instead of making the cakes, they just sat around at the table and read the cookbook.
Right.
And, and people were like, every year we have a tradition of these wonderful cakes. And it's almost like the emperor's new clothes. Somebody sits down and they're like, where's the cake? They're like, this is the cake. This is the cake. It's so wonderful. They're like, no, you're just reading about the cake, And so I almost feel like there's some opportunity this year to say, like, actually, maybe for the first time in our lifetime, but maybe for the first time in 2,000 years, we could actually figure out a way to have a Seder where it's a version of eating the cake, and not just reading the cookbook.
Exactly.
But I think that I want to go back to what you said about the question about going back to Egypt, because I think it's really striking and significant and should be reinforced, which is that even when I said it, I was kind of suggesting that even about us, that we say it was so great before the coronavirus, but we all had various problems in our lives, some of which, by the way, have gone away, right? Because we're working at home, so we don't have a long commute or whatever, they might be minor, but there are ways in which our life might be a little easier now that we're all working at home. And I can imagine that some of us will say, how can I retain some of this when this is over, right? But I think that what you pointed out is so important, which is that even if for you, it was better before, there were a lot of people that it was really terrible before. Now, the point is that it's not better now, right? Meaning it's not that there are a lot of people in the world and they were living this terrible life before the coronavirus and now they're loving life. No, it's still bad. The wilderness is worse than Egypt for everyone, right? The wilderness is terrible. and scary and chaotic and not good. Now, can we find a way to make something good out of the wilderness? Sure. But the point is that it is better than Egypt. It is worse than Egypt. Sorry, the wilderness is worse than Egypt, even if you were a slave. And the answer is not to go back to Egypt, right? The answer is to take the opportunity that you have left Egypt to say, okay, now where are we going? And that's where I really think like maybe what you raised earlier solves the problematic that I raised, which is that if we only focus on how we're suffering, we're going to have lost the 100 years of better Passover, when at least in theory we were reflecting on how our privilege makes us, but the fact that we were once slaves makes us more able to think about going out there and helping others. But I love how I think your framing allows us to say, because we're suffering, now we understand that so many others were suffering before and continue to suffer now with us. So now we're all suffering together. And how does that maybe let us go forward together in a new way?
Yeah. I think that's the queer overlay. For me, that's the queer. That's the queer read, right? Queer in the sense of not about gender, sexuality, queer about being on the margins and owning as super valuable your experience on the margin, and knowing that you have an insight about what's crashing, what doesn't work in our society and in the world, which you are now personally suffering from, but which every single person downstream from you will eventually suffer from. Guaranteed. That's the way it works. And so you have something really important to share with everyone else, not so that things get better for you, but so that things get better for everybody, because everyone's coming on this parade right behind us. You know, it's like, you know, the image from the movie The Ten Commandments, where all the Hebrews are leaving Egypt, and the line is so long that some of them are still back in Egypt, you know, while the ones in the front of the line are in the wilderness. And they're like, I'm still at home. Well, you're going to be in the wilderness really soon. Everybody's going to be in the wilderness really soon. The ones in the front only are the first ones to realize it. I lost my train of thought, but
no, but that connects to something that you and I have both been writing about in the last week, and it's, I think, a related point, but perhaps a little different. And I'd want you to reflect on where what you're saying is similar and a little different from what I'm saying, because you're talking about that there's this whole line of Israelites that are leaving Egypt, and some of them are still in the back and some of them are in the front. But the other piece is that there were already people in the wilderness that were not Israelites. And, you know, we could talk about, does that part matter? But I'm talking in particular about Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, who is a Midianite, and the Midianites are people of the wilderness. And in the Torah, in the book of Exodus, Jethro gives this famous sort of leadership advice to Moses. But the point is more that I've been reflecting on is that he was already a man of the wilderness when the Israelites came into the wilderness. And so he's like, hey, welcome, you know, I'm here, I know what to do. And when you were talking about the queer folk, that I was picturing more that they're the Jethros, rather than that they're the people, the Israelites at the front of the line. Not, my point is not that they're not Israelites, but my point is that there's a difference between let's say in my paradigm, when I was saying like, you know, there's some people that really had it really bad in Egypt, and we might have been the privileged ones, but now we're all out together. But there's also the people who maybe they were never from Egypt, or maybe they left Egypt a long time ago, and they've been hanging out here in the wilderness, and now they know some things, and they're here to welcome us and to maybe teach us a little. And that's how I see queer folk in this story, perhaps. And maybe there are other categories of people that say, hey, we kind of know how to live in this chaotic, scary world, and now everybody's here with us. So I wonder whether it flips the leadership paradigm, and it almost says, I wouldn't say that folks who have been mistreated by society for a long time have an obligation to play a leadership role, but I think they potentially have an opportunity to play a leadership role.
But I wouldn't say that flips the leadership paradigm. I'd say that's how the leadership paradigm has always been. It's always been that way. You know, as you point out, the parsha is called Yitro. It's not called Moses learns from Yitro. In other words, it's always been that in a time of enormous upheaval, The ones who are out in front are the ones who had been on the cutting edge of, what wasn't working and knew about it in the previous iteration. So I think it's always been that the quote unquote queer folk are the ones who are best suited to take the lead, because they're the ones who trust their own experience and say, it's valuable. It's not my personal experience. The feminists had it right when they said the personal is political. This is about the spiritual is political, and the economic is political, and the racial is it's the queer insight actually has nothing to do with gender or sexuality. The queer insight is, we trust our kishkis.
Uh-huh.
And that's if you've survived as a person of color, a person with disabilities, a person who's working class or poor, you survive because you've trusted that actually there is something valuable and profound about your experience. And if you've survived with a sense of dignity, it's because you've got things right and you have something very valuable to add. And that's what can make you a leader. So it's that sense of, I'm prioritizing and believing my experience beyond what the world tells me, because the world tells me something different about how the world should be. So I think that's how leadership has always been.
So let's make the connection between what we're talking about here in terms of the story of the Exodus from the Torah, and the story of Passover, the story of the Haggadah as told by the Haggadah. Because again, I think there's a piece here which a lot of people don't even realize, that they kind of gloss over it as they're reading it, and it's there, but they haven't been taught to see it, which is that the story that the Haggadah really tells is not the story of the Exodus, it's the story of the early rabbinic interpretation of the Exodus. And that's why we have these stories of, Rabbi Akiva and whoever that were studying up till late at night, and their students had to come and tell them it was time for the Shema, and all of this business that everybody's like, what's that there exactly? What's happening there? And I think that in a way, you talk about the early rabbis as being queer hippie folk, whatever your whole phrase is.
Queer fringy radical hippie.
Queer fringy radical hippie.
I understand that hippie doesn't exactly play anymore the way it plays in my own mind, but queer radical fringy. Yeah.
No, so like when we're having this conversation,
maybe it's lefty folk, okay.
But when we're having this conversation about like who the queer folk are today, and that in a way they're queer folk, they're Jews of color, they're LGBTQ, they're atheists, they're whoever has these like opinions that are not sort of welcomed in the mainstream, and they've been living out here in the wilderness all the time, and now all of a sudden everybody's here, and there's potential. And that you said that's how leadership works. Well, the Haggadah itself is telling us that story about the last time a crash happened, and it's telling us the stories of these certain small group of rabbis. They're very small group. I mean, you always talk about how the rabbis were always a small group, but the particular group of rabbis talked about in the Haggadah is a very small group of rabbis. And I'm kind of thinking about like, what can we say about the story of the rabbis and the story of rabbinic Judaism after the destruction of the Second Temple that would be especially valuable, again, as potentially a conversation starter for the Seder this year, because I think that if we are seeing, and I think that we could discuss it, and if you want to discuss it in this conversation, we can, and we can also discuss in other conversations, is this a big crash or not right now that we're facing? Like, it's obviously a terrible situation, and it's a terrible hiccup, but is it a crash? Is it really the case that it's not going to be the same on the other side, or are we,
if we get it right, it will be a crash.
Okay, but so to say more about that, but I wanted to say, like, if it is a crash, then what is the conversation that some of us should be having around the Seder table that says, hey, if this is a crash, let me actually not read so much the stories of the Red Sea and the plagues. I should actually be reading the stories of Rabbi Akiva and, and Rabban Gamliel and and Rabban Elazar ben Azariah, and those are the stories that I should really be focusing on this year's Passover, because those are the people who I'm going to be expected to model for the next bunch of years or for forever. So what would that look like?
Yeah, and let me throw another question into it, and that is, what are the stories we should be telling now? Are we able to tell new rabbinic stories now? Like one of our questions is, who are the rabbis now? Right? That's a question we learned from Yitz. That who are the rabbis now, and what are they already doing? That's the key. It's knowing where to look. When it looks like nothing is happening, you have to look. There's always something that's been happening, but you haven't been paying attention. So you have to look at who's already been crumbling, who's already on the margins, fixing things, who knows what's broken and has already been making efforts. And that's where you want to look. And those are the stories you want to tell. So I'm wondering, I think that's a question we can be asking at the Seder. Like, who's already been trying to, what's broken, who's fixing it, what are they doing that we're surfacing now that will become the stories in the next Haggadah of what those few people, those few fringy radical, maybe lefty, maybe whatever folk were doing in our time that nobody else was paying attention to.
Well, and on the one hand, obviously we can't know. It's too early to know, right? But
I'm not sure it's too early to know.
Okay.
I think some people know.
So say more.
But I think we should be asking, how we're supposed to welcome people to our Seder, welcome the stranger to our Seder. Who we should be having to our Seder virtually? We should be having the folks for whom the healthcare system wasn't working and for whom, capitalism had already crashed, and the people who, you get it. Those are the people we need to have at our Seder table to be telling us the stories of what actually is broken and what their community is doing. What are they already doing that,
I mean,
that we weren't noticing?
Just to state the obvious, because I want to really reinforce what you're saying, right? The reason why, privileged people in America are freaking out today about coronavirus, among other reasons, is because there's this idea that the hospitals are going to become too full of people that are sick, and there won't be a ventilator available for me if I get sick and need a ventilator, even though if I had a ventilator, I could have been healed, right? And so what you're freaking out about is that the only reason I'm going to die from this is because the healthcare system can't accommodate me. Well, that's exactly what everybody who doesn't have health insurance has been experiencing forever.
That's right.
That the health system in theory can help you, but it's not going to help you because for people like you, it's full. And I just want to say that for the benefit of folks who, need it, not in a bad way, but who would like it spelled out. I mean, that's what you're saying, and to have those folks in a more active way. I guess that would be my question. Does that mean, going out and invite? Well, we can't really invite people to our Seder this year. So what would that mean practically?
Well, maybe we invite them the same way we invite our families. I mean, if we do a virtual Seder, if you do a Zoom Seder, just it's sort of like they any kind of community gathering. It's like who we shouldn't be asking who should come. We should be asking who isn't coming, who wasn't invited that needs to be here, who was missing from our communities, who we really needed, not because we want to feel, charitable and feel like, oh, we're so virtuous because we're including everybody, but because they know some shit that we don't know and that we need to know. Like, who do we need? Because they know what we need to know to make our world better for everybody.
Right. By the way, we're not able to see the Facebook comments to our conversation in real time in quite an ongoing way, because otherwise we get too distracted. But I did just see one go by that suggested that I had overstated it in saying that we're freaking out because something bad might happen to us. That's just one of the reasons. There's a lot of reasons to freak out. So I'm just clarifying that I was just saying in terms of what you were talking about, that is one reason a lot of us are freaking out, and that one in particular is related to or is potentially resolved by or addressed by the proposal that you're making, that we actually seek out who knows things. And by the way, it's not necessarily that they know the answers, it's that they know the questions in ways that are more well put together than we know them, because they've been experiencing for a long time. And I think, again, that fits so much to Passover, the idea that
That's right.
Passover is not about the answers, it's about asking the right questions.
Yeah, I love that.
But can we talk back about the rabbis? I want to, because I really want to paint this picture for folks and say that, like, we could, if this is a crash, if this is the dawn of what Yitz Greenberg calls the third era of Judaism, that means that basically there was only one other major Jewish crash before, which was the destruction of the Second Temple. Now we could quibble and say there was also the destruction of the First Temple, so whatever, but there have not been that many crashes in the history of Judaism, or at least major crashes that have caused this total reorientation of Judaism. If that's the case, then it means we are living through a almost unique time in Jewish history. Or unique is the wrong word. I forget what the right word is to say that it's unusual, extremely unusual. And what that would mean is that if it's a crash, then everything changes on the other end, and that, among other things, there would be a new Haggadah, right? A new Seder, meaning a new order potentially for the Passover ritual. And we can imagine that just in the way that the rabbis created a new version where they put themselves at the center, it doesn't appear that way to a lot of people, but the way, if you look at the Haggadah, the rabbi's story of interpreting the Exodus story really is the center of the Haggadah. And so what would it look like to reimagine that story with a new group of people at the center? And what they're doing is interpreting what the rabbis were doing, which was interpreting the Torah. By the way, that's very much like the Haggadah, right? That cat ate the dog ate the cat, which ate the
Right.
that you're just adding layers upon layers, and so you don't get rid of the old story, you layer a new layer on top of it.
Right. Okay, here's what's coming up for me. Let's not forget that the Exodus story isn't just a story about this happened to me and so it shouldn't happen to anyone. It's a critique of the power structure. It's a critique of slavery. It's a critique of the capitalism of its time. And I think it's important to remember that. I forget what you said that, I don't know. Well, I lost my train of thought, and then my chair.
It's live TV.
Anyway, I forgot where we were, but there's something important in remembering that it's always been a bigger question, and the critiques, the people who know something about the suffering. Oh, I know where I was. Who knows something about the suffering of the world pre-corona have something to say now. That's about that system. Okay, where was I? I lost it again.
Okay, well, it'll come back to you.
It'll come back.
I guess my question, like, I'm just sort of picturing that.
Oh yeah, I know.
Yeah,
I got it now. Okay, and this is something that my friend and teacher and colleague, Rabbi Monica Gomer, reminds me of, and that is that actually in the current crash, what is crashing much bigger than Judaism is actually the world as we knew it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And let's not forget that Judaism, a lot of our tradition is working. Some of the details of whether we gather in person or whether we gather on Zoom, that's actually a detail. But the stuff of our tradition is actually helping us through the larger crash of the world. So rather than focusing on Judaism is crashing, which, as you know, I think it is,
right.
At the same time that it's crashing, there's this weird opportunity right now to find the stuff that is working in it. Somehow it's more available as the structures have loosened up a little. The stuff that's helping, there's a lot of stuff helping us through the crash of so many things in our world at large.
So
Anyway.
the only way that I would take exception with what you're saying or what Monica was saying is that I think a lot of times, and this came up on a recent Judaism Unbound episode, or maybe it was actually after the episode, where one of the guests sort of talked about how, as a rabbi, he likes Judaism, the way it is, or something along those lines, and I said, but I also like Judaism. The difference is that I think that it has wonderful parts inside of it, but that the connective tissue has fallen apart. And I think that a lot of rabbis, certainly, of course, not all, including your present company, that don't necessarily think so. But I think a lot of rabbis have been trained to think that the connective tissue is still kind of salvageable. And I'm saying that I think that what happens in a crash, and I think that this is what the early rabbis did with the Judaism that they inherited, is that they sifted through it. And that's why, by the way, Marie Kondo has been very powerful for me as a metaphor for saying, sometimes you have to sift through the stuff and say, well, this stuff can go forward, and this stuff, and I love how she holds it up and she thanks it for its service to her. It's really moving. And that's what
and the fact that it was at one point really important to you,
right,
that this dress
right,
was maybe the dress you were married in, or this outfit was your first day, actually doesn't mean it works for you now.
Right. It's not garbage. It's something that it's like when a person dies. It's like it did amazing things during its lifetime, and for one reason or another, it's not able to continue any longer. And I think that because I've hypothesized elsewhere that because we lack effective mourning rituals for elements of Judaism itself, right? We're very good at mourning people as Jews, typically. We're not very good at mourning Judaism, but I also think that we have technologies for doing that. We've just forgotten them. And because we don't know how to mourn for what we leave behind, we don't allow ourselves to leave anything behind. And then we're just constantly grasping to try to hold on to all of it, but you can't hold on to all of it. And when you try to hold on to too much, I mean, it's like when you have a huge pile of laundry and you're just trying to bring it all into the other room, some of the stuff falls down, and the stuff that falls is random. So instead of deciding what we're going to leave behind and deciding what we're going to take with us, we're just randomly leaving things behind because we have to leave something behind. So
it's like my carry-on. It's like my carry-on. I'm always packing everything I could possibly need in my carry-on, and then when I need it, there's no way I can get into my bag to find it. So I actually can't access anything in there.
Right. By the way, one of my favorite episodes of Marie Kondo's show was when she is helping this Japanese American family who actually inherited the house from the husband's parents. And in the process of tidying it up, they find these treasures of the parents that they never would have found had they not been willing to let go of their stuff. So in some ways, you're actually being more respectful to the past by tidying up and by getting rid of certain things that have been with you for a long time, because then you'll find the really ancient. So what I'm suggesting is, I mean, I know that we're not disagreeing really substantively, but what I'm suggesting is that in times of crash, that's when, for various reasons, there's an opportunity and a need to sift through everything that we have and to ask ourselves, can this component still work? Can this component not work? We're going to make mistakes. We're going to have, false positives and false negatives, and we're going to leave things behind that we should have taken and take things with us that we could have better left behind. But you go through that process, and then on the other end of it, I think you try to wire it together again in a new way. And that's what the rabbis did. And so for me, by the way, and an example, like I think when we do the Seder, we are role playing. We are living an example of something that the rabbis invented. There was no Seder before the rabbis. They took up, there were a lot of pieces. They ate matzah, maybe they had roasted food, the various symbols, but the rewiring it together in what we today call the Haggadah or the Seder was a rabbinic invention. And so the question to me is like, how might we reweave things together? So what I would say to people who have anxiety about how am I going to do the regular Seder that I'm used to, how am I going to do that over Zoom? I might say to those folks, maybe take this as an opportunity to not do that, and to take this as an opportunity to say, if I had to start from scratch, because kind of we do, and I want to sift through what we have in the Haggadah and what we have in terms of the meaning of Passover, then maybe like let's do an experiment this, and maybe we're going to have 100,000 experiments this year. And I wish that we were more advanced. I mean, we have some ideas through Jewish Live and Judaism Unbound of one day creating a sort of an online meetup space where people can sort of share their ideas. And I think of it as like the old commercials for Reese's peanut butter cups, where your chocolate falls into my peanut butter and it tastes great together. You know, that we could have all these people experimenting and then running into each other and sharing, and then maybe that's how the new Passover emerges. But I feel like we could embrace the possibility that some of that's going to happen this year, and that's the rabbinic moment.
Exactly, it's a rabbinic moment. It's more likely that we will do that and be creative in that way if we remember that that's the most traditional thing we could possibly do.
Right.
And if you really believe that, then you have a boldness and an experimentalness, and that's how to be most deeply Jewish right now.
Right. I would say it's the most traditional thing that we know how to do, but it's a tradition that we only practice very rarely. Like, right? Like, so let's go back to where we started in the conversation, because I loved how you framed it, that the holidays are these annual opportunities to turbocharge a certain principle. So in this, for Passover, maybe it's the principle that we love the stranger because we are strangers, or whatever it might be. That we have a major festival once a year where we remind ourselves in a serious way about that principle. And it's maybe such a fundamental principle that we only have to do that once a year, as opposed to Shabbat, which we have to have every week in order to remind ourselves to rest, right? Mm-hmm. You could say that maybe we also have a tradition once in 2,000 years where we do this total rewiring of Judaism. And
we condoize the tradition.
Right. So yes, it's traditional, but it's not traditional necessarily in the way that I think sometimes people hear it when you say it, or when I say that, oh, we should be doing this forever, all the time. We should always be, some people are like, no, I just want it to be like calm and back to normal. And you're like, it will be, but we need a few years of this tradition.
That's great. That's great. I love it. The every 2,000 years traditions.
Right.
It's so that time again.
It's that time. And by the way, and I would just say also, like, one of the really difficult things that I think we're experiencing an example of it now is what happens when we encounter things in our lives that by definition, almost by definition, nobody alive today could possibly have experienced before in their lives. So the usual sources of wisdom are absent. And I'm trying to sort of play out this idea that that's why we have wisdom traditions like Judaism, is that it's sending us messages from people who did experience it. And maybe these are these kind of things that only happen once in 2,000 years. And by the way, what that means is that when we're done with this, we have a sacred obligation to find a way to transmit it to our descendants 2,000 years from now. That's a big responsibility. But I think we are living in a time when we're going to have that responsibility.
I agree with you completely. I went to the University of Illinois, and I think I've told this story before, right in front of the Union building is a statue called the Alma Mater. And the plaque on it says, 1921, to the children of the future, the children of the past send their greetings. And we have to look at the tradition as this sort of instruction manual of our accumulated past, saying, we've been there. We've been there before. You don't worry. You don't have to stand on our shoulders. Learn from us. You're right. That's right. The value of a tradition. That's what it's here to do. To say your life is not long enough, and don't be so hubristic to think that you can draw on your life experience alone and come up with really great answers to problems. That would be so silly. Right? I mean, it would be like doing medicine where you only prescribe medicine that you had thought up. Well, that's dumb, right?
Right.
Use the medicine the folks behind you have already figured out. Yeah.
Well, Benay, like it's almost the hour, and it's one of these. I have this experience pretty much every time I commit to doing an hour show on live TV, which is about 15 minutes in. I have this feeling like, are we going to be able to fill the time? But then by about 30 minutes in, I'm like, are we going to be able to wrap it up in time? So I feel like really this is an amazing conversation. I'm just wondering if there's anything else you feel burning to say, because I think we can go a little over an hour if you do, because this is here to help people. And so if you have any other thoughts, like let's share them, and if not, and or when you're done, we'll close it out.
Well, I have this idea that the 613 commandments really were never meant to be upon each individual's shoulders. I don't know if this is true or not. I'm just sort of cooking this up, but I think there's a lot of evidence in the tradition to support the idea that it actually is a communal lift. And there's probably no way every one of us is going to get the 613 down and live a life of the 613. But if there's one mitzvah that's like, yes, I am all about that. I am all over Sukkot. There's a story of this one rabbi who Sukkot was his holiday, and all year he was saving money to buy the etrog, and he was gathering the wood and for the walls, and he was, you name it. His whole world was centered around Sukkot, and okay, he's holding down Sukkot. I want him in my community, and I want someone else holding down, you get the idea. Well, that comes to mind right now because there's going to be some raggedy Seders happening in a week. You know what I mean? But if we don't worry about our one Seder getting it right, but we realize that we're all going to be experimenting, and I'm going to get a piece of it right, and someone else is going to get another piece of it right, and someone else is going to get another piece. And then as long as we talk to each other afterward, so maybe that's going to be on Jewish Live, where we put, right, we all share the piece that we think we might have gotten right. Maybe there's going to, maybe that's the way traditions work anyway. I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at earlier. It's like, I mean, I was really inspired by Tiffany Schlein and her idea of the tech Shabbat, but not by that specific idea, but the fact that she was doing this one thing. And that if 100,000 people, 10,000 people could be doing one thing, and then we could find a way to trade them around and see what everybody's doing, that's how, like, just like you said, that's how this new thing comes about.
Right.
Well, so I think that for anyone who's enjoyed this conversation, I'll just say two things. One is that we're going to be having similar conversations with other folks over the course of the next 10 days or whatever until Passover, not necessarily every day, but many days. And so you can check those out on jewishlive.org or on our Facebook feed. And also that you and I, Benay, are going to be doing a weekly show on Jewish Live called Talking Talmud. And it's going to be on Thursdays at noon Eastern time and 9 a.m. Pacific time. And ironically, we're both in Chicago, and so it's 11 Central time. But I think it's helpful to put those in the time zones that people tend to be thinking about. And we're going to be doing that. We're hoping that it's going to be some kind of format where every other week we talk about some piece of Talmud that we think is really important and relevant. And then on the alternate weeks, we're talking to a professor or a Talmud scholar of some kind that is just really an interesting person to talk to and has ideas about the Talmud. And so we're really excited to get that going. Do you want to share any other ways that people might connect with what you're doing these days?
Sure. Well, at Svara, we have a really sweet daily Mishnah collective. So at 12:30 Central Time, 1:30 Eastern, 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time, we do a half hour of learning, and you don't need any Hebrew. You don't even need your alphabet for this. And we're working through one of my favorite texts, which is essentially how to be the Jewish conception of a human being. Who is the person that our entire tradition exists to create? And it's what has given me a sense of joy every day. It's the tradition, like one of our spiritual technologies really working, and it gets me through the day every day. It's 30 minutes and it's a lot of fun. So I welcome everyone to that, among other things,
Amazing.
but yeah.
Yeah, and on Jewish Live, we're going to be trying to we're trying to make it a hub where you can find everything that basically everybody's doing that's live. And as we start to get things built up, that's also not live. So there's already a lot of stuff there. If you go to www.jewishlive.org/Passover, you will find your way into all the Passover, particularly this year Passover stuff that we're collecting. We're still in the process of finishing out that area, but there's still a lot of good stuff there already. So encourage people to go and explore there. And if you're not finding what you're looking for today, try it again tomorrow, because a lot of stuff is getting added. And there was a question in the comments asking, are we starting our Talmud thing this Thursday? And we are. Probably pretty stupid to do it, but we are. And and so we invite you all to join us. And Benay, thank you so much for this hour. I think it's really going to be helpful to people in thinking about their Seders.
Well, it was a lot of fun. I always love hanging out with you.
Me too.
Thanks,
All right,
Dan.
everybody. We'll see you soon.